The US military has been involved with the country of Iraq for a very long time, but this might all be coming to an end. According to the Prime Minister of Iraq, he is done with US military operations within his country. He wants the US military out, and quickly. But there is a massive, and I mean massive, underlying issue here. According to the Pentagon, no one has sent them a formal letter, and they have no idea what anyone is talking about whenever it gets brought up to them. And to make things even worse for the US military, even if they wanted to ignore this threat or to try and lay low, it's nearly impossible with all of the attacks that have been happening on the US military. But the true underlying question is the US military really getting kicked out of Iraq? Well, before we can dig into all of the evidence and really bring everything into context, I need you to do me the biggest favor ever. Since this channel has no sponsors or anything of that matter, I need you to please at least turn on the notifications or interact with this video. That way you don't miss any more of my videos because I'm sick and tired of people missing my videos. YouTube has a very odd algorithm, so do me a big favor, leave a comment, like, or at least turn on the notifications. Now, why in 2024 all of a sudden is the US military being threatened to get kicked out of Iraq? You would assume that the US military has a great relationship with Iraq, considering back in 2014 the US military essentially saved the country of Iraq from being overrun by IS. And I definitely cannot say their full name on YouTube, but you can go ahead and look up who exactly IS are. They're a really bad group of people who, again, almost literally took over the entire country for themselves. Well, ever since the restabilization of Iraq, the United States has actually managed to lay rather low. You almost never heard about anything US military within the Middle East, and we almost forgot the US military was in Iraq. Most of the focus shifted from Iraq over into Afghanistan. But there was really one key moment that turned everything around for the US military, where ultimately all eyes were on the US military and everyone started to question, why are we even in Iraq anymore? On January 3rd, 2020, Qasem Soleimani was taken out by a US military airstrike, and in retaliation there was a direct action attack straight from Iran on a US military base. Luckily, no one was injured. There were some serious injuries of TBI, traumatic brain injuries, but again, no US personnel were injured. Qasem Soleimani was essentially a very high-value target for the United States military since the beginning of the Iraq War. This is the man who is said to be behind what are called EFPs. This was a very devastating device that was taking out US military personnel left and right. And so President Trump decided, you know what, we're going to go after this high-ranking target, and we're going to do it over the sovereign nation of Iraq. And because of this, this absolutely pissed off Iraq because the United States almost started an entire regional war within the Middle East. And so the outcome of this, all the way back in 2020, before we get back to 2024, the US military essentially was backed into a corner where they were forced to stop all direct action and military action type missions. Essentially, the only reason why the US military was allowed to be in Iraq was to help advise the professional military of Iraq and to help stop IS from ever coming into Iraq ever again. Because even at this time, the US military was under a high threat to get kicked out of Iraq. Now, you probably never heard about this, or the media did not talk about this because, again, most people were just focusing on the dumb tweets Donald Trump said or what was happening in Afghanistan. This really got swept under the rug, but if you go into your research and go check back into the history books, the US military, even back in 2020, 2021, almost got kicked out of Iraq even back then. Now, when we fast forward up to 2024, let us remember that the United States military left on a very, very bad note in Afghanistan. We can argue all day on whether or not the US military actually lost the war in Afghanistan, but one thing is for sure, the final pictures that everyone will ever remember about Afghanistan are people literally trying to hang on to cargo jets trying to leave the country. That will forever be the Afghanistan war in our history books, unless you decide to actually see what the purpose was of Afghanistan. Nonetheless, this is rather important because, again, people question, to include the United States, do we even need to be in the Middle East other than to try and create some sort of stability? Because, again, we left on a very bad note. Now we bring ourselves to October 7th of 2023, and of course this is when Hamas decided to attack Israeli territory and did what they did. I mean, there's millions of videos about this, you guys know what they did. But again, the main reason why we need to bring this up and why this is all in context is because if there was one country who was willing to stand with Israel on that day, no matter what, it was the United States. And so we know the US military decided to start building and building and building up their forces within the Middle East, bringing 2 aircraft carrier groups, bringing in submarines, bringing in F-15s, F-16s, bringing in everything they had to ensure that no countries or any sort of militaries will go after Israel. The main mission, or the new mission for the US military in the Middle East, was specifically to ensure that Israel will be safe. Now, one thing I really want to point out is that although the United States in the Middle East is really there to protect Israel, the United States also has their own missions, but this has sort of become a blurred line because when you try to check why the US military is there other than to protect Israel, all missions change to, well, we're protecting Israel. But over in Iraq, according to high-ranking officials, well, we're in Iraq to stop IS. And because of this, the country of Iran has seemed to have found a loophole in the United States saying, well, we're only here to fight IS. During the next few months, from October 7th to where we are today in 2024, we have seen attacks nearly every single day, sometimes twice a day. Last time I checked, from the time I'm making this video, we are up to about 130 attacks between Syria, but mostly on Iraqi territory towards US forces. The reason why this is relevant is because the militia groups going after the United States, they were backed by Iran. And if the United States is making a public proclamation of, well, we're in Iraq not only to protect Israel, but we're also here to make sure IS doesn't come back, well, that means any militant group that's not IS, let's go after the United States because they're not here to go after us. And so it wasn't until about 60 to 70 attacks in where the US military, Joe Biden, finally decided we literally have to do something about this. We can't just sit here. We have to strike back. We are tired of getting hit left and right. And so what the US military did, and it made headlines throughout the world, was that the US military sent out an AC-130 Ghost Rider and went after militant members. And I should throw this in there, the main group in charge of all of this is of course the Islamic Resistance of Iraq. A little side note, no one's ever heard of them until October 7th, and all of a sudden this group just pops up. But one thing we do know is that they for sure are backed by Iran. Now, while all of these attacks were happening, this was putting Iraq in a very odd position because Iraq and everyone in the world knew the reason why the US military was being attacked was because they are very close, if not the closest allies with Israel. So if we can't get to Israel, let's at least get after the United States within Iraq. Logistically speaking, this is actually a lot more convenient for Iran considering they are neighbors with Iraq. So it's a lot easier to have a command control center and to get proper intel for the militants to go after the US military. Now, I want to make this analogy so you can kind of get into the mindset of where Iraq is. Imagine you own your own street. You have your own street and you're smack dab in the middle. But on one side of the street, let's say about 30% of the street, it just is under constant threat. There are stray rounds coming your way, and there's just a lot of chaos over here, and it's really hard to go to sleep, and it's really unsafe over here. You would imagine that the rest of your street would not be too happy about this, considering we live on a safe street, but all the way on the other end, we have to be really cautious. That's essentially what's happening in Iraq. I'm trying to simplify this because even though, directly speaking, no Iraqi citizens have been hurt, or there's not too much action going on within heavily populated areas, nonetheless, there's still like this mini war going on between the United States and these militant groups, even though the US military said we're done with direct combat operations. And look, without a doubt, the US military does have the right to defend themselves, but we're talking attack after attack after attack, day in and day out. So the absolute final straw is the fact that the United States decided that we're going to strike a target within Baghdad. The United States military essentially brought the fight into a more populated area, and this heavily pissed off the Iraqi government, the Prime Minister of Iraq, and the Iraqi people. And look, I gotta be honest with you, if I'm trying to be super down the middle here, I would assume that the people of Iraq are just sick and tired of constantly seeing on the news, another attack happened, this attack happened, another attack happened at their capital. And so, because of this, the Prime Minister of Iraq has officially stood up and said, we are done. You need to get out of our country. The only way that all of this violence is going to stop, and they know this, is if the war in Israel will end. Well, unfortunately for everyone, a report did just come out while I was making this video, really, that the Prime Minister of Israel himself denied ending the war with Hamas because he has always said straightforward that the only way this war will end is if Hamas doesn't exist anymore. Which means Israel will fight this war indefinitely unless a miracle happens, which a miracle could happen and this war ends. But speaking of today, it doesn't look like this war is ending anytime soon, and Iraq knows this. Something else that's vitally important is that the Prime Minister of Iraq has recently also been really hyping up the country of Iran, saying they are our neighbors, we should start to work together, and maybe the two countries can really be the ones who cause regional stability, because it's obviously not going to be the US military. And so these sequence of events, even all the way back to 2020, 2021, and then constant attacks day in and day out from October 7th of 2023 all the way up to 2024 today, with all of these attacks happening, all of these threats happening throughout the country of Iraq, the people have had enough, and that is why they want the US military out. However, we have to remember this. The country of Iran did recently do something that may have absolutely destroyed their chance of ever working with Iraq. They decided to strike the city of Erbil on Iraqi territory, not telling anyone, and they went after a high-value target that Iran calls Israeli spies or pro-Israeli, anti-Iran targets. Iran also decided to go after Pakistani targets on Pakistani sovereign territory. And so because of this, this actually pissed off Iraq to the point where, you know, maybe they're thinking this is not the greatest thing right now to work with Iran because we don't know if we can trust them. Something else to bring into context, when the whole IS thing was happening back in 2014, 2015, and 2016-ish, Iran did come into Iraq to try helping them, mostly pro-Iranian militants. However, those pro-Iranian militants did turn the tables of they did go after IS, but they also started to go after pro-Saddam units. And so there's always been this very odd situation between the countries of Iran and Iraq. Let us remember, even back in the history books, they have gone to war against one another. So this is a little speculation. The US military might rely on the fact of there's always been strife between the two countries for regional stability, or to at least be the powerhouse of the Middle East. But one thing is for sure, Iran has found the loophole by using Iraq to go after their own targets, the US military. So we'll see what happens. This is ultimately why the US military will be getting kicked out of Iraq, according to Iraq. Now, according to the United States military, they haven't heard anything. Now, I've been covering the US military for a very long time now, and one place I was covering them very heavy was back in Niger, Africa. And this is the first time I noticed throughout the last 20 years of how the US military has been operating, this is the first time in Niger, Africa where the US military stayed very quiet about all of the situation there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Niger was thrown over by a junta, and at the time, France was being kicked out, and many people questioned, well, why isn't the US military being kicked out if the French military is being kicked out? The French kept threatening war and going after Niger and bringing all of Africa together. The US military just sat back, stayed quiet, and they didn't even call it a junta or a overthrowing of the president. They just sat back and waited. Now, this might have been to the demise of the US military because currently in Niger, Africa, the US military is doing nothing, but they're still there. Point being, the US military might be trying to implement this military strategy of, hey, you know what? Let's just stay quiet. Maybe this will all blow over. If we speak too aggressively, things happen to us. So let's just stay quiet. And without a doubt, the US military knows this is happening, and there has to be some sort of backdoor deals going on. I mean, I don't even think this is speculation or getting into conspiracy. The US military needs and has to stay in Iraq within the Middle East. That is a very strategic position for the United States military to put direct pressure on the country of Iran, if need be. So anyway, that is what's going on. If you're still around and watching this video, make sure you leave your comments and opinions down below. Do I think the United States will get kicked out of Iraq? I'm going to be honest with you, most likely not. But we'll see what happens. As long as this war continues in Israel, the United States military will continue to get attacked.